1941. German bomber crews owned the night sky over Britain until they started vanishing without warning, ripped apart by invisible fire they never saw coming. The Luftwaffe couldn't understand how the British were hunting them in total darkness, picking them off one by one from over 5 miles away. What revolutionary weapon system turned the hunters into the hunted, and why did Nazi intelligence completely fail to see it coming? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. In the autumn of 1940, Britain stood alone against the most powerful military machine the world had ever seen. Every night, as darkness fell over the English Channel, the people of London, Coventry, Birmingham, and dozens of other cities heard a sound that made their blood run cold. It was the deep, rhythmic drone of German bomber engines crossing the black sky above them. The Luftwaffe owned the night. Their crews flew with confidence born from months of unopposed raids, dropping tons of high explosives and incendiary bombs on factories, homes, and churches below. The Nazi war machine seemed unstoppable, and the night belonged to them completely. British defenses were desperate and primitive. Fighter Command had tried everything they could think of to stop the nightly terror. They sent up Bristol Blenheim fighters, twin-engine aircraft that were supposed to hunt the bombers in darkness. But these planes were too slow and nearly blind. Pilots strained their eyes trying to spot enemy aircraft against the black void of night sky. Sometimes they saw nothing for hours. Other times they glimpsed an exhaust flame for just a second before losing it again. It was like trying to catch ghosts. On the ground, massive searchlight batteries swept the sky with brilliant white beams, hoping to illuminate a target for the anti-aircraft guns. But German pilots had learned to avoid these lights easily. They simply flew around them or above them. The searchlights created more dramatic shadows than actual targets. The heavy anti-aircraft guns fired blindly upward, sending shells exploding at different heights, hoping to get lucky. Most nights they hit nothing but empty air. The noise was tremendous, the light show impressive, but the German bombers kept coming through. Inside the bomber cockpits, Luftwaffe crews had grown almost relaxed about their missions over Britain. They were experienced men, veterans of the campaign in France and the Low Countries. They flew Heinkel He-111 bombers with their distinctive greenhouse-style cockpits, or the sleeker Dornier D-17s, or the versatile Junkers Ju-88s. These aircraft carried thousands of pounds of bombs deep into British territory. The crews used a clever radio navigation system called Knickebein, which sent intersecting radio beams to guide them precisely to their targets. They flew in loose formations, navigating by familiar landmarks below when the moon was bright enough. On cloudy nights, they relied entirely on their radio beams and instruments. The men in these bombers chatted with each other over the intercom. They smoked cigarettes and made jokes. Some brought sandwiches from home. They discussed what they would do on leave, whether they would visit Berlin or return to their families in Bavaria or Prussia. The flight to Britain and back took several hours, but it had become routine work. Yes, there were anti-aircraft bursts below, and yes, sometimes a searchlight caught them for a moment. But actual danger felt remote. The British night fighters almost never found them. The odds of being intercepted in the vast darkness were tiny. These crews believed they were practically invisible once the sun went down. At RAF stations across southern and eastern England, a different story was unfolding. Exhausted pilots slumped in their flight gear, frustrated beyond words. Ground crews worked on aircraft they knew were inadequate for the job. Radar operators sat in front of glowing cathode ray tubes in dark rooms, watching primitive green blips that told them almost nothing useful. The early radar systems could detect bomber formations approaching the coast, which helped, but once British fighters were airborne, they were on their own. There was no way to guide them to a target they could not see with their own eyes. The RAF needed a miracle, and they were building one in secret. At Bristol Aircraft Company, engineers had created something extraordinary. It was called the Beaufighter, a name that combined beauty and fighter into one word. This aircraft was different from anything else in the sky. It had two powerful engines that made it fast enough to catch any German bomber. It had thick armor and could take punishment. But most importantly, it was big enough to carry a revolutionary new piece of equipment that would change night warfare forever. The equipment was called AI Mark IV, which stood for Airborne Intercept Radar. It was a compact radar system that fit inside the Beaufighter's nose. While the pilot flew the aircraft, a radar operator sat behind him watching a small screen. This screen could detect other aircraft in the darkness from miles away. Not feet, not hundreds of yards, miles. The system could pick up a bomber at a range of 5.5 miles, even in total darkness, even through clouds. The British had invented a way to see invisible enemies. But the Beaufighter was not just about seeing, it was about killing. In its nose, beneath the radar equipment, 4 20mm Hispano cannons were mounted. These were not small machine guns, these were explosive cannons that fired shells the size of a man's thumb. Each shell could punch through aluminum and explode inside an aircraft's fuselage. 6 additional machine guns were built into the wings. When all guns fired together, the Beaufighter could tear a bomber apart in seconds. In late 1940, the first Beaufighter squadrons became operational. The German bomber crews knew nothing about them. Nazi intelligence had no idea this weapon system existed. The Luftwaffe continued their nightly raids with full confidence. They climbed into their aircraft as darkness fell, started their engines, and lifted off from airfields in occupied France, Belgium, and Holland. They formed up over the Channel and turned toward Britain, following their radio beams toward cities that waited in the blackout below. They had no idea that invisible hunters were lifting off to meet them. Hunters with electronic eyes that could see 5.5 miles through solid darkness. Hunters with cannon that could destroy them before they even knew they were being followed. The German crews were about to discover that the night no longer belonged to them. But first, they had to survive learning that lesson. Most would not get that chance. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. The first Beaufighter night patrols began on cold October evenings in 1940. Inside the cockpit, the pilot sat surrounded by glowing instrument dials. Behind him, separated by a thin metal bulkhead, the radar operator hunched over his small green screen in near total darkness. The screen showed a sweeping line that rotated like a clock hand, painting faint blobs of light when it detected something solid in the sky ahead. The two men wore heavy flight suits and leather helmets with oxygen masks dangling at their chins. They communicated through crackling intercom systems, their voices tinny and distant, even though they sat just feet apart. Meanwhile, high above the English Channel, German bomber crews droned toward their targets with no sense of danger whatsoever. Inside a Heinkel 111, 5 men went about their duties with practiced ease. The pilot held the control yoke steady, keeping his altitude at exactly 4,000 meters. His co-pilot monitored the engine instruments and made notes on a clipboard strapped to his knee. Behind them, the bombardier lay in the glazed nose section, peering down at the dark landscape below, trying to identify landmarks. The radio operator listened to the Knickebein navigation beams through his headphones, occasionally calling out course corrections. In the rear, the gunner sat at his position, but his machine gun pointed uselessly at empty sky. There was nothing to shoot at. There never was at night. The bomber crews talked easily among themselves. One man mentioned that his wife had sent him apple cake from home. Another complained about the cold, even though they wore heated flight suits. They discussed whether they would reach their target city in another 20 minutes or 30. Someone made a joke about British anti-aircraft gunners who could not hit the broadside of a barn. They all laughed. The engines hummed their steady rhythm. Everything felt routine and safe. 20 miles away, a Beaufighter had just taken off from a coastal station. The pilot pushed the throttles forward and felt the twin engines roar with power. The heavily armed fighter climbed steeply into the darkness. Once at altitude, the pilot leveled off and began a wide patrol pattern. Behind him, the radio operator switched on his equipment and watched the screen flicker to life. At first, there was nothing but background noise and ground clutter. Then, slowly, a small bright blob appeared near the edge of the screen. The radio operator's voice came through the intercom, calm but focused. Contact, bearing 030 degrees, range 5 miles. 5 miles. The German bomber was still far beyond visual range, invisible in the total darkness. But on the green radar screen, it glowed like a small star. The pilot turned the bow fighter toward the bearing and increased speed. The distance began to close. Inside the German bomber, nothing had changed. The crew continued their mission exactly as planned. They had no warning system, no alert, no indication whatsoever that death was approaching from behind. The Luftwaffe had never equipped its bombers with rear-looking radar because they never imagined anyone could find them in the dark. Why would they need such equipment when British night fighters were known to be nearly useless? The bow fighter's radar operator kept calling out updates. 4 miles, 3.5 miles, turning slightly left, match his turn. The pilot adjusted his course, following the invisible target like a bloodhound following a scent. His hands were steady on the controls. His heart rate stayed normal. This was not a desperate chase or a lucky accident. This was a methodical hunt, guided by science and precision. The British had turned night fighting into a calculated science. At 3 miles, the gap continued closing. At 2 miles, the pilot began looking ahead through his windscreen, even though he knew he would see nothing yet. At 1 mile, the radar operator's voice became more urgent. Dead ahead. Close now. Very close. The pilot squinted into the darkness. Then he saw it. 2 faint orange glows, side by side. Exhaust flames from the bomber's engines. They looked like distant cigarettes floating in an infinite black void. The pilot eased the bow fighter into position behind and slightly below the bomber. He could see the dark silhouette now, a shadow against shadows. The bomber was straight and level, completely unaware. The German crew was probably discussing their bomb run or thinking about breakfast after they landed. The bow fighter pilot armed his guns. His thumb rested on the firing button. He closed to 300 yards, then 200. He could see the bomber's shape now, the twin tail fins, the greenhouse cockpit glowing faintly from instrument lights inside. He pressed the firing button. The 4 cannon in the bowfighter's nose erupted with blinding flashes. Tracer rounds laced through the darkness in bright streams. The 6 wing machine guns joined in, creating a cone of fire that reached out and touched the bomber. The explosive cannon shells hit the Heinkel's fuselage and detonated. Metal ripped apart. Fuel tanks ruptured and burst into flame. The bomber's right engine exploded in a ball of orange fire. Inside the German aircraft, the world ended without warning. 1 second, the crew was calm and relaxed. The next second, their plane was disintegrating around them. Cannon shells tore through the thin aluminum skin like it was paper. Shrapnel flew everywhere. Control cables snapped. Hydraulic fluid sprayed across the cockpit. Men screamed into their intercom microphones, but there was nothing anyone could do. The Heinkel rolled onto its back and began a spinning dive toward the black earth 4,000 meters below. The bowfighter pilot watched the bomber fall, trailing fire and debris. He did not celebrate. He simply broke away, climbed back to patrol altitude, and waited for his radar operator to find another target. This was the new reality of night warfare, though the Luftwaffe did not know it yet. Over the following weeks and months, German bomber losses began climbing in ways that Luftwaffe commanders could not explain. Crews that took off for routine night missions simply disappeared. Some were seen exploding in mid-air over England. Others crashed into the channel with no distress calls, no warning, nothing. A few managed to limp back to their bases in France with massive damage, their survivors babbling about being attacked from nowhere. The pattern made no sense. British night fighters had been nearly harmless for the entire war. Now suddenly they were killing experienced bomber crews in significant numbers. Intelligence officers interviewed the survivors carefully. The stories they heard were all remarkably similar and deeply troubling. The bomber crews insisted they had no warning at all. No searchlights had caught them, no anti-aircraft fire had damaged them first. They were flying along normally one moment, and the next moment cannon shells were ripping through their aircraft from behind. Most crews never even saw their attacker. Those who did glimpse something described only muzzle flashes in the darkness and a dark shape that vanished as quickly as it appeared. Several survivors used the same word to describe the experience: ambush. They felt ambushed in the middle of empty sky. Luftwaffe command struggled to understand what had changed. They knew the British had radar stations along the coast that could detect approaching bomber formations, but that was ground-based early warning radar. It helped the British prepare, but it could not guide individual fighters to individual bombers in the vast darkness. That would require some kind of radar in the fighter aircraft itself, which the Germans believed was technically impossible. The equipment would be too large, too heavy, too power-hungry to fit in a fighter plane. Their own scientists had told them this. Therefore, it could not be what the British were doing. Some Luftwaffe officers suggested the British had developed incredibly sensitive night vision equipment or infrared detection systems. Others proposed that British pilots had been specially trained to fly by starlight and had memorized the exhaust patterns of German engines. A few even suggested that the British were using trained birds or some kind of biological detection method. The theories grew more desperate as the losses mounted. Nobody wanted to believe that British technology had leapfrogged ahead of German capabilities. That contradicted everything Nazi propaganda had taught them about area superiority in science and engineering. Then, in early 1941, a Beaufighter was damaged by anti-aircraft fire and forced to make an emergency landing in France. German troops rushed to the crash site and captured the aircraft before the crew could destroy it. Engineers carefully examined every part of the strange British fighter. They found the 4 massive cannons in the nose. They found the thick armor plating. They found the powerful engines. And then they found something that made their hands shake as they took notes. In the nose, above the cannons, was a compact radar system with a rotating antenna and a display screen. It was small enough to fit in a fighter aircraft. It was sophisticated enough to detect targets at ranges the Germans had thought impossible. And it worked. The captured equipment was shipped to Germany for detailed analysis. Nazi scientists took it apart piece by piece. What they discovered shattered their confidence completely. The British had invented a device called a cavity magnetron that generated powerful radar signals from a surprisingly small package. This was the key breakthrough that made airborne intercept radar possible. German radar technology was years behind. The British had not just matched German capabilities, they had surpassed them in fundamental ways. When captured Luftwaffe crews were shown photographs of the Beaufighter's radar equipment during interrogation, their reactions were recorded by British intelligence officers. One pilot stared at the images for a long time before speaking. He said that everything he had been told about British backwardness was clearly a lie. He had flown dozens of missions believing the darkness protected him. Now he understood he had been visible the entire time, lit up on radar screens like a beacon. He asked how many of his friends had died not knowing they were being hunted by an enemy that could see them from miles away. Another captured German officer, a bomber commander with the Knight's Cross, sat in an interrogation room at an RAF station and asked to see the Beaufighter in person. The British decided to allow it, figuring the war had already moved past the point where this knowledge mattered. They walked him out to the flight line where several Beaufighters were parked. He circled the aircraft slowly, taking in every detail. He touched the radar housing in the nose. He looked at the cannon ports. He examined the twin engines and the heavy construction. Finally, he turned to his British escort and spoke in careful English. He said that if Germany had possessed even a few dozen of these aircraft in 1940, Britain would have been defeated. But now, Britain had hundreds of them, and Germany had nothing equivalent. The war, he said quietly, was already lost. It was just a matter of time. The ideological collapse happened differently for different men, but it followed a similar pattern. Everything Nazi leadership had told them about German technological supremacy was revealed as propaganda. The British were not inferior. They were not weak or backward. They had simply been working in secret on revolutionary systems while German leadership grew overconfident. The Beaufighters and their radar represented something deeper than just one weapon. They represented a systematic approach to innovation that Germany had failed to match. British scientists, engineers, and military planners had identified a problem, developed a solution, and deployed it at scale. They had done this while enduring nightly bombing raids on their cities. They had outthought and outbuilt the supposedly master race. For the captured crews sitting in POW camps, this realization changed everything. The propaganda had been lies. The confident predictions of easy victory had been fantasies. And thousands of good men had died because German leadership believed its own myths instead of respecting what their enemy was capable of achieving. The war ended in May 1945, with Germany in ruins. Former Luftwaffe bomber crews who had survived captivity in British and American POW camps began the long journey home. They traveled by train and truck through a landscape they barely recognized. Cities they remembered as clean and prosperous were now fields of rubble. Factory districts that once hummed with activity stood silent and gutted. Railway stations were bombed-out shells. Bridges had collapsed into rivers. Everywhere they looked, they saw destruction on a scale that seemed almost impossible. When these men finally reached their hometowns and villages, the contrast hit them like a physical blow. They had spent years in Allied captivity, seeing abundance and industrial power on a scale Germany never possessed. Now they returned to a country where people were starving, where children begged for food from occupying soldiers, where the entire economy had collapsed. The gap between what they had witnessed in Britain and America versus what remained of Germany was almost too large to process. It felt like returning from a different world entirely. One former bomber pilot named Werner returned to Hamburg in the summer of 1945. His city had been devastated by firestorm raids that killed tens of thousands. The neighborhood where he grew up was gone completely, replaced by acres of brick rubble and twisted metal. He found his mother living in the basement of a partially destroyed building, sharing space with 3 other families. She had not seen him in nearly 3 years and wept when he appeared at the doorway. That night, sitting on a makeshift bed in the cold basement, she asked him the question everyone in Germany was asking. How did we lose? How did the mighty German military machine get crushed so completely? Werner thought carefully before answering. He told her about the Beaufighters and their radar systems. He explained how British technology had made German night bombing operations suicidal long before most people realized the war was turning. But then he went deeper. He said the Beaufighters were just one example of a bigger problem. While German leadership had grown drunk on early victories and convinced themselves of their own superiority, the Allies had quietly revolutionized warfare. They had developed proximity fuses for artillery shells. They had cracked German communication codes. They had built radar networks that tracked everything in the sky. They had produced aircraft and tanks and ships in quantities Germany could never match. And they had done all of this while German propaganda insisted the enemy was weak and inferior. His mother listened quietly. She asked if she was saying that Germany lost because of lies. Werner nodded slowly. He said the lies went deeper than anyone understood. The Nazi leadership had told the German people they were fighting inferior races who could never match Aryan intelligence and determination. But Werner had seen the truth firsthand. The British scientists who invented airborne radar were not inferior. The American engineers who built thousands of bombers were not weak. The Allied military planners who coordinated operations across multiple continents were not stupid. Germany had lost because it believed its own propaganda instead of honestly assessing what it was up against. Other returning veterans carried similar lessons home with them. A former radio operator named Klaus had been shot down over England in 1941 and spent 4 years in a POW camp in Yorkshire. During his captivity, he had been assigned to work on a British farm. The farmer and his wife treated Klaus with surprising kindness, despite the fact that German bombers had killed the farmer's brother in London. They shared meals with him, they taught him better English. When the war ended and Klaus prepared to return to Germany, the farmer's wife packed him a box of food for the journey, knowing that food was scarce back home. Klaus brought that memory back to Munich along with the physical box, which he kept long after the food was eaten. He told anyone who would listen about the British family that had treated an enemy prisoner with dignity and respect. He said this taught him something important about the difference between propaganda and reality. Nazi ideology had insisted that showing mercy was weakness and that enemies deserved only cruelty. But the British farmer and his wife had shown him that strength could coexist with kindness and that treating people with dignity did not make a nation weak. In fact, it seemed to make them stronger. For many veterans, the hardest part of coming home was watching their fellow Germans refuse to learn these lessons. Some neighbors insisted that Germany had only lost because of betrayal or bad luck, not because the Allied powers had simply been better prepared and more innovative. Some former Nazi officials claimed that if only Germany had been given more time or more resources, victory would have been certain. These attitudes frustrated the veterans who had seen the truth with their own eyes. They knew that Germany had not lost because of accidents or betrayal. Germany had lost because overconfidence and ideology had blinded its leaders to reality. Werner kept a small notebook during his years in captivity. In it, he had written observations and thoughts about what he witnessed. Years after the war, his daughter found the notebook and asked him about one particular entry. It was dated November 1943, written in a British POW camp. The entry read, "We thought we owned the night sky. We thought our enemies were too weak and stupid to stop us. Then one night the darkness came alive with cannon fire, and we learned the truth too late. Propaganda cannot defeat physics. Believing you are superior does not make it so. The British saw us from 5 miles away, and we saw nothing until we were already dead. That invisible line we crossed without knowing marked the real beginning of our defeat. Everything that came after was just the slow unfolding of that single truth." His daughter asked what he meant. Werner explained that the Bow fighters had taught him the most important lesson of his life. He said that respect for your enemy's capabilities, honest assessment of reality, and constant innovation matter more than ideology or propaganda. Any nation that believes it is naturally superior will eventually meet someone who simply worked harder and thought more clearly. When that happens, all the propaganda in the world cannot save you from the consequences of your arrogance. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.